Hi, this is Lynn Turback, and in this sequence of screencasts, we're going to talk about parameters in Java. And we're first going to motivate the notion of a parameter. And the idea of parameters is to be able, in methods, to be able to describe computational processes that are almost exactly the same, except for a few small parts. And I'm going to illustrate this in the context of recipes. We've said before that algorithms are a lot like recipes, so we expect to find analogs of everything that we talk about in terms of methods and algorithms in terms of recipes. And here we have a recipe for an Indian dish called gobi aloo, which is a cauliflower and potato dish. And the word gobi is an Indian word for cauliflower, and aloo is an Indian word for potato. And here we have a recipe. It has a bunch of ingredients and tells us how to put everything together. And the thing we want to focus on is this part over here in the ingredient list, which is that we have one cauliflower and we use 2 medium potatoes. The other thing I want to focus on is at the end of the recipe is that there's a note here about variations that we can have on this recipe. For instance, we could make spinach aloo. And what we would do in that case is, rather than using the cauliflower, we'd use spinach. And rather than using 2 medium potatoes, we'd use 4. We could make cabbage aloo. In that case, we would use cabbage instead of the cauliflower. And we'd use 2 medium potatoes. And here is matar and aloo. Matar is a word for peas. We replace the cauliflower by peas and use 4 medium potatoes. Now the question is, why did the author and publisher decide to put in this area over here, rather than, say, making separate recipe pages for all of these? And one, of course, is cost and efficiency. It would be a waste of paper when the only difference between these recipes is one ingredient and the number of potatoes. But even more important is if we did have 4 different recipes for these 4 different variations of this dish, then someone who was reading the recipe would have to figure out that the only difference between them was, in fact, the number of, or rather the vegetable that we were including here and the number of potatoes. And we want to make it very clear when we're defining this recipe that that is the only difference. So here's the notion that we want to capture. These recipes are all the same, except for the following parts. We have here, we have something which is a whole. I'm going to call this whole veg to indicate this is where the vegetable goes. And here's another whole, which we're going to call num pots for the number of potatoes. So the idea is we really want a recipe with holes. And we want to say, in some cases, we are going to fill these holes with some things, and in other cases, we're going to fill them with other things. So when we're defining a recipe with holes, that's part of a method definition. Methods have 2 parts. We define them. That's the method definition. And then a separate part is when we invoke the method. So here, rather than saying that we want to have gobi aloo, what we really want is we want to say, aha, in this case we have aloo, and what we want to fill the first hole is cauliflower, and what we want to fill the second hole is the number 2 for 2 medium potatoes. And this is called a method invocation. Invocation is when we're using our definition. And part of the invocation is we want to specify what things are going to fill the hole. So in this case, cauliflower fills the vegetable hole, and the number 2 fills the number of potatoes hole. Whereas, say down here, if we're going to make spinach aloo, then we want to invoke the aloo method with spinach, which is our vegetable in that case, and the number 4. So in this case, we want spinach to fill the vegetable hole, and we want 4 to fill the number of potato hole. Let's bring this back to Java by reviewing the notion of method that we introduced last time. So recall we had a Buggle named Spot who could go off and draw a dog house, and maybe Spot wanted to draw 2 dog houses. And one way to accomplish that was to repeat the same sequence of statements more than once. And anytime we see what is essentially the same sequence of statements executed more than once, we want to encapsulate that into something called a method. So here was the way that we did that last time. We said, oh, we can go off and we can define a method down here which encapsulates over the sequence of statements. So again, this is the definition part of a method. We are defining a method. And here we have what's called the body of the method, which says what the method does for a living. So this is defining action and not actually doing it. In order to do the action, we need to invoke the method. So here we have two invocations of the method. And each of the invocations, when we invoke it, it causes the sequence of actions in the body to happen. And we explain that via the Java execution model. Now suppose we want our puppy Buggle to draw bigger dog houses like this yellow one that we see here. Well, one approach is to define a completely different method called build big dog house. And the only difference between build big dog house and the build dog house we saw before is that rather than going forward 2 each time, the Buggle goes forward 4 each time. But that's such a minor difference, and for the same reason we wanted to abstract over the Gobbly-Aloo recipe, we would like to have a single recipe for building dog houses that's somehow abstracted over a property of the doghouse. And so we can imagine instead that we have a parameterized method here. And here we're looking again at the invocation side, when we're using the method. And in this case, we would like the method to be abstracted over the side length of the doghouse. So the first time when Spot builds a doghouse, it builds a doghouse of side length 3. And when Lassie builds the doghouse, it builds a doghouse of side length 5. Well, how can we achieve that in Java? It turns out that here we are, we're looking at now the definition side of the equation. So here we're looking at a method definition. And what we can have here is something called a formal parameter name. So a formal parameter name is a name for a hole that we are going to have in our method body. So this is called a formal parameter name. And we can think that everywhere we use that name in the body, it refers to a hole that we are filling. So for instance, in the case where we provide, say, the number 3 as an argument, that 3 will get put into each of the spots where we use the name n. That's the idea. So n is the name of a hole. Now additionally, Java requires us to define something called the type of the formal parameter. So here we have the formal parameter type, and all it says in Java is that the thing that fills the whole n must be an integer. So this is a hand-wavy description of what happens when we call a method with a parameter. Next, we're going to see how to explain this in terms of the Java execution model.